This is a continuation of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, comprising Part 8, Chapters 1 through 9, and the end.
Part 8. For What Men Died. Part 8, Chapter 1. In this book one have written in a blunt way some episodes of the war as I observed them, and gained first-hand knowledge of them in their daily traffic. I have not painted the picture blacker than it was, nor selected gruesome morsels and joined them together to make a jigsaw puzzle for ghoulish delight. Unlike Henry Barbus, who, in his dreadful book, Le Fire, gave the unrelieved blackness of this human drama, I have here and in other books shown the light as well as the shade in which our men lived, the gaiety as well as the fear they had, the exultation as well as the agony of battle, the spiritual ardor of boys as well as the brutality of the task that was theirs. I have tried to set down as many aspects of the war's psychology as I could find in my remembrance of these years, without exaggeration or false emphasis, so that out of their confusion, even out of their contradiction, the real truth of the adventure might be seen as it touched the souls of men. Yet when one strives to sum up the evidence and reach definite conclusions about the motives which led men of the warring nations to kill one another year after year in those fields of slaughter, the ideals for which so many millions of men laid down their lives, and the effect of those years of carnage upon the philosophy of this present world of men, there is no clear line of thought or conviction. It is difficult at least to forecast the changes that will be produced by this experience in the social structure of civilized peoples, and in their relations to one another, though it is certain, even now, that out of the passion of the war, a new era in the world's history is being born. The ideas of vast masses of people have been revolutionized by the thoughts that were stirred up in them during those years of intense suffering. No system of government designed by men afraid of the new ideas will have power to kill them, though they may throttle them for a time. For good or ill, I know not which, the ideas germinated in trenches and dugouts, in towns under shell fire or bomb fire, in hearts stricken by personal tragedy or world agony, will prevail over the old order which dominated the nations of Europe, and the old philosophy of political and social governance will be challenged and perhaps overthrown. If the new ideas are thwarted by reactionary rulers endeavoring to jerk the world back to its old-fashioned discipline under their authority, there will be anarchy reaching to the heights of terror in more countries than those where anarchy now prevails. If by fear or by wisdom the new ideas are allowed to gain their ground gradually, a revolution will be accomplished without anarchy. But in any case, for good or ill, a revolution will happen. It has happened in the sense that already there is no resemblance between this Europe after the war and that Europe before the war, in the mental attitude of the masses toward the problems of life. In every country there are individuals, men and women, who are going about as though what had happened had made no difference, and as though, after a period of restlessness, the people will settle down to the old style of things. They are merely sleepwalkers. There are others who see clearly enough that they cannot govern or dupe the people with old spell words, and they are struggling desperately to think out new words which may help them to regain their power over simple minds. The old gangs are organizing a new system of defense, building a new kind of Hindenburg line behind which they are dumping their political ammunition. But their Hindenburg line is not impregnable. The angry murmur of the mob, highly organized, disciplined, passionate, trained to fight, is already approaching the outer bastions. In Russia the mob is in possession, wiping the blood out of their eyes after the nightmare of anarchy, encompassed by forces of the old regime, and not knowing yet whether its victory is won or how to shape the new order that must follow chaos. In Germany there is only the psychology of stunned people, broken for a time in body and spirit, after stupendous efforts and bloody losses which led to ruin and the complete destruction of their old pride, philosophy, and power. The revolution that has happened there is strange and rather pitiful. It was not caused by the willpower of the people, but by a cessation of willpower. They did not overthrow their ruling dynasty, their tyrants. The tyrants fled, and the people were not angry, nor sorry, nor fierce, nor glad. They were stupefied. Members of the old order joined hands with those of the people's parties, out to evolve a republic with new ideals based upon the people's will and inspired by the people's passion. The Germans, after the armistice and after the peace, had no passion, as they had no will. They were in a state of coma. The knockout blow had happened to them, and they were incapable of action. They just ceased from action. They had been betrayed to this ruin by their military and political rulers, but they had not vitality enough to demand vengeance on those men. The extent of their ruin was so great that it annihilated anger political passion, pride, all emotion except that of despair. How could they save something out of the remnants of the power that had been theirs? How could they keep alive, feed their women and children, pay their monstrous debts? They had lost their faith as well as their war. Nothing that they had believed was true. They had believed in their invincible armies, and the armies had bled to death and broken. They had believed in the supreme military genius of their warlords, and the warlords, blunderers as well as criminals, had led them to the abyss and dropped them over. They had believed in the divine mission of the German people as a civilizing force, and now they were despised by all other peoples as a brutal and barbarous race, in spite of German music, German folk songs, German art, German sentiment. They had been abandoned by God, by the protecting hand of the Alts Gutes Deutsches Gottes, to whom many had prayed for comfort and help in those years of war, in Protestant churches and Catholic churches, with deep piety and childlike faith. What sins had they done that they should be abandoned by God? The invasion of Belgium. That, they argued, was a tragic necessity. Atrocities? Those were, they believed, the inventions of their enemies. There had been stern things done, terrible things, but according to the laws of war. Frank's tirers had been shot. That was war. Hostages had been shot. It was to save German lives from slaughter by civilians. Individual brutalities, yes. There were brutes in all armies. The U-boat war. It was, said the German patriot, to break a blockade that was starving millions of German children to slow death, condemning millions to consumption, rickets, all manner of disease. Nurse Cavell? She pleaded guilty to a crime that was punishable, as she knew, by death. She was a brave woman who took her risk open-eyed and was judged according to the justice of war, which is very cruel. Poison gas. Why not, said German soldiers, when to be gassed was less terrible than to be blown to bits by high explosives. They had been the first to use that new method of destruction, as the English were the first to use tanks, terrible also in their destructiveness. Germany was guilty of this war, had provoked it against peaceful peoples. No, 1,000 times no. They had been, said the troubled soul of Germany, encompassed with enemies. They had plotted to close her in. Russia was a huge menace. France had entered into alliance with Russia and was waiting her chance to grab at Alsace-Lorraine. Italy was ready for betrayal. England hated the power of Germany and was in secret alliance with France and Russia. Germany had struck to save herself. It was a war of self-defense to save the fatherland. The German people still clung desperately to those ideas after the armistice, as I found in Cologne and other towns, and as friends of mine who had visited Berlin told me after peace was signed. The Germans refused to believe in accusations of atrocity. They knew that some of these stories had been faked by hostile propaganda, and knowing that, as we know, they thought all were false. They said lies, 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 and made counter-charges against the Russians and Poles. They could not bring themselves to believe that their sons and brothers had been more brutal than the laws of war allow, and what brutality they had done was imposed upon them by ruthless discipline. But they deplored the war, and the common people, ex-soldiers and civilians, cursed the rich and governing classes who had made profit out of it, and had continued it when they might have made peace with honor. That was their accusation against their leaders, that, and the ruthless, bloody way in which their men had been hurled into the furnace on a gambler's chance of victory, while they were duped by faked promises of victory. When not put upon their defense by accusations against the whole fatherland, the German people, as far as I could tell by talking with a few of them, and by those letters which fell into our hands, revolted in spirit against the monstrous futility and idiocy of the war, and were convinced in their souls that its origin lay in the greed and pride of the governing classes of all nations, who had used men's bodies as counters in a devil's game. That view was expressed in the signboards put above the parapet. "We're all fools, let's all go home," and in that letter by the woman who wrote, "For the poor here it is terrible, and yet the rich, the gilded ones, the bloated aristocrats, gobble up everything in front of our very eyes. All soldiers, friend and foe, ought to throw down their weapons and go on strike, so that this war, which enslaves the people more than ever, may cease." It is that view, terrible in its simplicity, which may cause a more passionate revolution in Germany when the people awaken from their stupor. It was that view which led to the Russian Revolution and to Bolshevism. It is the suspicion which is creeping into the brains of British working men and making them threaten to strike against any adventure of war, like that in Russia, which seems to them, unless proved otherwise, on behalf of the gilded ones and for the enslavement of the peoples. Not to face the truth is to deny the passionate convictions of masses of men in Europe. That is one key to the heart of the revolutionary movement which is surging beneath the surface of our European state. It is the belief of many brooding minds that almost as great as the direct guilt of the German warlords was the guilt of the whole political society of Europe, whose secret diplomacy, unrevealed to the peoples, was based upon hatred and fear and rivalry in play for imperial power and the world's markets, as common folk play dominoes for penny points, and risking the lives of common folk in a gamble for enormous stakes of territory, imperial prestige, the personal vanity of politicians, the vast private gain of trusts and profiteers. To keep the living counters quiet, to make them jump into the pool of their own free will at the word go, the statesmen, diplomats, trusts and profiteers debauch the name of patriotism, raise the watchword of liberty, and play upon the ignorance of the mob easily, skillfully, by inciting them to race hatred, by inflaming the brute passion in them, and by concocting a terrible mixture of false idealism and self-interest, so that simple minds, quick to respond to sentiment, as well as those quick to hear the call of the beast, rally shoulder to shoulder and march to the battlegrounds under the spell of that potion. Some go with a noble sense of sacrifice, some with bloodlust in their hearts, most with the herd instinct following the lead, little knowing that they are but the pawns of a game which is being played behind closed doors by the great gamblers in the courts and foreign offices and committee rooms and counting houses of the political casinos in Europe. I have heard the expression of this view from soldiers during the war and since the war, at street corners, in tram cars, and in conversations with railwaymen, mechanics, policemen, and others who were soldiers a year ago or stay-at-homes thinking hard over the meaning of the war. I am certain that millions of men are thinking these things because I found the track of those common thoughts crude, simple, dangerous among Canadian soldiers crossing the Atlantic, in Canadian towns, and in the United States, as I had begun to see the trail of them far back in the early days of the war when I moved among French soldiers, Belgian soldiers, and our own men. My own belief is not so simple as that. I do not divorce all peoples from their governments as victims of a subtle tyranny devised by statesmen and diplomats of diabolical cunning and by financial magnates ready to exploit human life for greater gains. I see the evil which led to the crime of the war and to the crimes of the peace with deep spread roots to the very foundation of human society. The fear of statesmen, upon which all international relations were based, was in the hearts of peoples. France was afraid of Germany and screwed up her military service, her war preparations, to the limit of national endurance, the majority of the people of France accepting the burden as inevitable and right. Because of her fear of Germany, France made her alliance with Russian Tsardom her intent cordiale with Imperial England, and the French people poured their money into Russian loans as a life insurance against the German menace. French statesmen knew that their diplomacy was supported by the majority of the people by their ignorance as well as by their knowledge. So it was in Germany. The spell words of the German warlords expressed the popular sentiment of the German people, which was largely influenced by the fear of Russia in alliance with France, by fear and envy of the British Empire and England's sea power, and by the faith that Germany must break through that hostile combination at all costs in order to fulfill the high destiny which was marked out for her, as she thought, by the genius and industry of her people. The greed of the bloated aristocrats was only on a bigger scale than the greed of the small shopkeepers. The desire to capture new markets belonged not only to statesmen but to commercial travelers. The German peasant believed as much in the might of the German armies as Hindenburg and Ludendorff. The brutality of German generals was not worse than that of the Unteroffizier or the foreman of works. In England there was no traditional hatred of Germany, but for some years distrust and suspicions, which had been vented in the newspapers, with taunts and challenges, stinging the pride of Germans and playing into the hands of the Junker caste. Our war psychology was different from that of our allies because of our island position and our faith in sea power, which had made us immune from the fear of invasion. It took some time to awaken the people to a sense of real peril and of personal menace to their hearths and homes. To the very end, masses of English folk believed that we were fighting for the rescue of other peoples, Belgian, French, Serbian, Romanian, and not for the continuance of our imperial power. The official propaganda, the words and actions of British statesmen, did actually express the conscious and subconscious psychology of the multitude. The call to the old watchwords of national pride and imperial might thrilled the soul of a people of proud tradition in sea battles and land battles. Appeals for the rescue of the little nations struck old chords of chivalry and sentiment, though with a strange lack of logic and sincerity. Irish demand for self-government was unheeded. Base passions as well as noble instincts were stirred easily. Greedy was the appetite of the mob for atrocity tales. The more revolting they were, the quicker they were swallowed. The foul absurdity of the corpse factory was not rejected any more than the tale of the crucified Canadian, disproved by our own GHU, or the cutting off of children's hands and women's breasts, for which I could find no evidence from the only British ambulances working in the districts where such horrors were reported. Spy mania flourished in mean streets. German music was banned in English drawing rooms. Preachers and professors denied any quality of virtue or genius to German poets, philosophers, scientists, or scholars. A critical weighing of evidence was regarded as pro-Germanism and lack of patriotism. Truth was delivered bound to passion. Hatred at home, inspired largely by feminine hysteria and official propaganda, reached such heights that when fighting men came back on leave, their refusal to say much against their enemy, their straightforward assertions that Fritz was not so black as he was painted, that he fought bravely, died gamely, and in the prison camps was well-mannered, decent, industrious, good-natured, were heard with shocked silence by mothers and sisters who could only excuse this absence of hate on the score of war weariness. Part 8, Chapter 2. The people of all countries were deeply involved in the general blood guiltiness of Europe. They made no passionate appeal in the name of Christ or in the name of humanity for the cessation of the slaughter of boys and the suicide of nations, and for a reconciliation of peoples upon terms of some more reasonable argument than that of high explosives. Peace proposals from the Pope, from Germany, from Austria, were rejected with fierce denunciation, most passionate scorn, as peace plots and peace traps, not without the terrible logic of the vicious circle, because, indeed, there was no sincerity of renunciation in some of those offers of peace, and the powers hostile to us were simply trying our strength and our weakness in order to make their own kind of peace, which should be that of conquest. The gamblers, playing the game of poker with crowns and armies as their stakes, were upheld generally by the peoples, who would not abate one point of pride, one fraction of hate, one claim of vengeance, though all Europe should fall in ruin and the last legions of boys be massacred. There was no call from people to people across the frontiers of hostility. Let us end this homicidal mania. Let us get back to sanity and save our younger sons. Let us hand over to justice those who will continue the slaughter of our youth. There was no forgiveness, no generous instinct, no large-hearted common sense in any combatant nation of Europe. Like wolves, they had their teeth in one another's throats, and would not let go, though all bloody and exhausted, until one should fall at the last gasp, to be mangled by the others. Yet in each nation, even in Germany, there were men and women who saw the folly of the war and the crime of it, and desired to end it by some act of renunciation and repentance, and by some uplifting of the people's spirit to vault the frontiers of hatred and the barbed wire which hedged in patriotism. Some of them were put in prison. Most of them saw the impossibility of counteracting the forces of insanity which had made the world mad, and kept silent, hiding their thoughts and brooding over them. The leaders of the nations continued to use mob passion as their argument and justification, excited it anew when its fires burned low, focused it upon definite objectives, and gave it a sense of righteousness by the high-sounding watchwords of liberty, justice, honor, and retribution. Each side proclaimed Christ as its captain, and invoked the blessing and aid of the God of Christendom. Though Germans were allied with Turks and France was full of black and yellow men, the German people did not try to avert their ruin by denouncing the criminal acts of their warlords, nor by deploring the cruelties they had committed. The Allies did not help them to do so, because of their lust for bloody vengeance and their desire for the spoils of victory. The peoples shared the blame of their rulers because they were not nobler than their rulers. They cannot now plead ignorance or betrayal by false ideals which duped them, because character does not depend on knowledge, and it was the character of European peoples which failed in the crisis of the world's fate, so that they followed the call back of the beast in the jungle, rather than the voice of the crucified one, whom they pretended to adore. Part 8, Chapter 3. The character of European peoples failed in common sense and in Christian charity. It did not fail in courage to endure great agonies, to suffer death largely, to be obedient to the old tradition of patriotism and to the stoic spirit of old fighting races. In courage, I do not think there was much difference between the chief combatants. The Germans, as a race, were wonderfully brave until their spirit was broken by the sure knowledge of defeat and by lack of food. Many times through all those years they marched shoulder to shoulder, obedient to discipline, to certain death, as I saw them on the Somme, like martyrs. They marched for their fatherland, inspired by the spirit of the German race, as it had entered their souls by the memory of old German songs, old heroic ballads, their German home life, their German women, their love of little old towns on hillsides or in valleys, by all the meaning to them of that word Germany, which is like the name of England to us, who is fool enough to think otherwise, and fought often, 1,000 times, to the death, as I saw their bodies heaped in the fields of the Somme, and round their pill-boxes in Flanders, and in the last phase of the war behind the Hindenburg line, round their broken batteries on the way of Mons and Le Cateau. The German people endured years of semi-starvation and a drain of blood greater than any other fighting people before they lost all bold vitality, hope, and pride and made their abject surrender. At the beginning they were out for conquest, inspired by arrogance and pride. Before the end they fought desperately to defend the fatherland from the doom which cast its black shadow on them as it drew near. They were brave, those Germans, whatever the brutality of individual men and the cold-blooded cruelty of their commanders. The courage of France is to me like an old heroic song, stirring the heart. It was medieval in its complete adherence to the faith of valor and its spirit of sacrifice for la patrie. If patriotism were enough as the gospel of life, Nurse Cavell did not think so. France as a nation was perfect in that faith. Her people had no doubt as to their duty. It was to defend their sacred soil from the enemy which had invaded it. It was to hurl the brutes back from the fair fields they had ravaged and despoiled. It was to liberate their brothers and sisters from the outrageous tyranny of the German yoke in the captured country. It was to seek vengeance for bloody, foul, and abominable deeds. In the first days of the war France was struck by heavy blows which sent her armies reeling back in retreat, but before the first battle of the Marne, when her peril was greatest, when Paris seemed doomed, the spirit of the French soldiers rose to a supreme act of faith, which was fulfilled when Foch attacked in the center, when Manoury struck on the enemy's flank, and hundreds of thousands of young Frenchmen hurled themselves, reckless of life, upon the monster which faltered, and then fled behind the shelter of the Aisne. With bloodshot eyes and parched throats and swollen tongues, blind with sweat and blood, mad with the heat and fury of attack, the French soldiers fought through that first battle of the Marne and saved France from defeat and despair. After that, year after year, they flung themselves against the German defense and died in heaps, or held their lines, as at Verdun, against colossal onslaught, until the dead lay in masses. But the living said, "They shall not pass," and kept their word. The people of France above all, the women of France behind the lines, were the equals of the fighting men in valor. They fought with despair through many black months and did not yield. They did the work of their men in the fields, and knew that many of them, the sons or brothers or lovers or husbands, would never return for the harvest time, but did not cry to have them back until the enemy should be thrust out of France. Behind the German line, under German rule, the French people, prisoners in their own land, suffered most in spirit, but were proud and patient in endurance. "Why don't your people give in?" asked a German officer of a woman in Nessel. "France is bleeding to death." "We shall go on for 2 years or 3 years or 4 or 5, and in the end we shall smash you," said the woman who told me this. The German officer stared at her and said, "You people are wonderful." Yes, they were wonderful, the French, and their hatred of the Germans, their desire for vengeance, complete and terrible, at all cost of life, even though France should bleed to death and die after victory, is to be understood in the heights and depths of its hatred and in the passion of its love for France and liberty. When I think of France, I am tempted to see no greater thing than such patriotism as that to justify the gospel of hate against such an enemy, to uphold vengeance as a sweet virtue. Yet if I did so, I should deny the truth that has been revealed to many men and women by the agony of the war, that if civilization may continue, patriotism is not enough, that international hatred will produce other wars worse than this, in which civilization will be submerged, and that vengeance, even for dreadful crimes, cannot be taken of a nation without punishing the innocent more than the guilty, so that out of its cruelty and injustice new fires of hatred are lighted. The demand for vengeance passes to the other side, and the devil finds another vicious circle in which to trap the souls of men and catch him all alive. To deny that would also be a denial of the faith with which millions of young Frenchmen rushed to the colors in the first days of the war. It was they who said, "This is a war to end war." They told me so. It was they who said, German militarism must be killed so that all militarism shall be abolished. This is a war for liberty. So soldiers of France spoke to me on a night when Paris was mobilized and the tragedy began. It is a Frenchman, Henri Barbès, who, in spite of the German invasion, the outrages against his people, the agony of France, has the courage to say that all peoples in Europe were involved in the guilt of that war, because of their adherence to that old barbaric creed of brute force, and the superstitious servitude of their souls to symbols of national pride based upon military tradition. He even denounces the salute to the flag, instinctive and sacred in the heart of every Frenchman, as a fetish worship in which the narrow bigotry of national arrogance is raised above the rights of the common masses of men. He draws no distinction between a war of defense and a war of aggression, because attack is the best means of defense, and all peoples who go to war dupe themselves into the belief that they do so in defense of their liberties and rights and power and property. Germany attacked France first because she was ready first and sure of her strength. France would have attacked Germany first to get back Alsace-Lorraine, to wipe out 1870, if she also had been ready and sure of her strength. The political philosophy on both sides of the Rhine was the same. It was based on military power and rivalry of secret alliances and imperial ambitions. The large-hearted internationalism of Jean Jaurès, who with all his limitations was a great Frenchman, patriot and idealist, had failed among his own people and in Germany. And the assassin's bullet was his reward for the adventure of his soul to lift civilization above the level of the old jungle law, and to save France from the massacre which happened. In war, France was wonderful, most heroic in sacrifice, most splendid in valor. In her dictated peace, which was ours also, her leaders were betrayed by the very evil which millions of young Frenchmen had gone out to kill at the sacrifice of their own lives. Militarism was exalted in France above the ruins of German militarism. It was a peace of vengeance which punished the innocent more than the guilty, the babe at the breast more than the junker in his schloss, the poor working woman more than the warlord, the peasant who had been driven to the shambles more than Sixt von Arnim or Ruprecht of Bavaria, or Ludendorff or Hindenburg. It is a peace that can only be maintained by the power of artillery and by the conscription of every French boy who shall be trained for the next war of defense, 20 years hence, 30 years hence. When Germany is strong again, stronger than France, because of her population, stronger then, enormously, than France, in relative numbers of able-bodied men, than in August 1914. So if that philosophy continue, and I do not think it will, the old fear will be re-established, the old burdens of armament will be piled up anew, the people of France will be weighed down as before under a military regime, stifling their liberty of thought and action, wasting the best years of their boyhood in barracks, seeking protective alliances, buying allies at great cost, establishing the old spy system, the old diplomacy, the old squalid ways of international politics, based as before on fear and force. Marshal Foch was a fine soldier. Clemenceau was a strong minister of war. There was no man great enough in France to see beyond the passing triumph of military victory and by supreme generosity of soul to lift their enemy out of the dirt of their despair, so that the new German Republic should arise from the ruins of the empire, remorseful of their deeds in France and Belgium, with all their rage directed against their ancient tyranny, and with a new-born spirit of democratic liberty reaching across the old frontiers. Is that the foolish dream of the sentimentalist? No, more than that. For the German people, after their agony, were ready to respond to generous dealing, pitiful in their need of it. And there is enough sentiment in German hearts, the most sentimental people in Europe, to rise with a surge of emotion to a new gospel of atonement, if their old enemies had offered a chance of grace. France has not won the war by her terms of peace, nor safeguarded her frontiers for more than a few uncertain years. By harking back to the old philosophy of militarism, she has re-established peril amid a people drained of blood and deeply in debt. Her support of reactionary forces in Russia is to establish a government which will guarantee the interest on French loans and organize a new military regime in alliance with France and England. Meanwhile, France looks to the United States and British people to protect her from the next war, when Germany shall be strong again. She is playing the militarist role without the strength to sustain it. Part 8, Chapter 4. What of England looking back at the immense effort of the British people in the war, our high sum of sacrifice in blood and treasure, and the patient courage of our fighting men? The world must, and does, indeed, acknowledge that the old stoic virtue of our race was called out by this supreme challenge and stood the strain. The traditions of 1,000 years of history filled with war and travail and adventure, by which old fighting races had blended with different strains of blood and temper, Roman, Celtic, Saxon, Danish, Norman, survived in the fiber of our modern youth, country bred or city bred, in spite of the weakening influences of slumdom, vicious environment, ill nourishment, clerkship and sedentary life. The Londoner was a good soldier. The Liverpools and Manchesters were hard and tough in attack and defence. The South Country battalions of Devons and Dorsets, Sussex and Somersets were not behindhand in ways of death. The Scots had not lost their fire and passion, but were terrible in their onslaught. The Irish battalions, with recruiting cut off at the base, fought with their old gallantry until there were few to answer the last roll call. The Welsh dragon encircled Mametz Wood, devoured the cockchafers on Pilkham Ridge, and was hard on the trail of the Black Eagle in the last offensive. The Australians and Canadians had all the British quality of courage and the benefit of a harder physique gained by outdoor life and unweakened ancestry. In the mass, apart from neurotic types here and there among officers and men, the stock was true and strong. The spirit of a seafaring race, which has the salt in its blood from Land's End to John O'Groats and back again to Wapping, had not been destroyed, but answered the ruffle of Drake's drum and, with simplicity and gravity in Royal Navy and in Merchant Marine, swept the highways of the seas, hunted worse monsters than any fabulous creatures of the deep, and shirked no dread adventure in the storms and darkness of a spacious hell. The men who went to Zeebrugge were the true sons of those who fought the Spanish Armada and singed the King o' Spain's beard in Cadiz harbour. The victors of the Jutland battle were better men than Nelson's, the scourings of the prisons and the sweepings of the press gang, and not less brave in frightful hours. Without the service of the British seamen, the war would have been lost for France and Italy and Belgium, and all of us. The flower of our youth went out to France and Flanders, to Egypt, Palestine, Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, and Saloniki, and it was a fine flower of gallant boyhood, clean, for the most part eager, not brutal except by intensive training, simple in minds and hearts, chivalrous in instinct, without hatred, adventurous, laughter-loving, and dutiful. That is God's truth, in spite of vice-rotted, criminal, degenerate, and brutal fellows in many battalions, as in all crowds of men. In millions of words during the years of war recorded the bravery of our troops on the Western Front, their patience, their cheerfulness, suffering, and agony, yet with all those words describing day by day the incidents of their life in war, one did not exaggerate the splendor of their stoic spirit or the measure of their sacrifice. The heroes of mythology were but paltry figures, compared with those who, in the Great War, went forward to the roaring devils of modern gunfire, dwelt amid high explosives more dreadful than dragons, breathed in the fumes of poisoned gas more foul than the breath of Medusa, watched and slept above mine craters which upheaved the hellfire of Pluto, and defied thunderbolts more certain in death, dealing blows than those of Jove. Something that was in the spirit of our men which led them to endure these things without revolt, ideals higher than the selfish motives of life. They did not fight for greed or glory, not for conquest, nor for vengeance. Hatred was not the inspiration of the mass of them. For I am certain that except in hours when men see red, there was no direct hatred of the men in the opposite trenches, but on the other hand, a queer sense of fellow feeling, a humorous sympathy for old Fritz, who was in the same bloody mess as themselves. Our generals, it is true, hated the Germans. I should like 1 week in Cologne, one of them told me, before there seemed ever a chance of getting there, and I would let my men loose in the streets and turn a blind eye to anything they liked to do. Some of our officers were inspired by a bitter, unrelenting hate. If I had 1,000 Germans in a row, one of them said to me, I would cut all their throats and enjoy the job. But that was not the mentality of the men in the ranks, except those who were murderers by nature and pleasure. They gave their cigarettes to prisoners and filled their water bottles and chatted in a friendly way with any German who spoke a little English, as I have seen them time and time again on days of battle, in the fields of battle. There were exceptions to this treatment, but even the Australians and the Scots, who were most fierce in battle, giving no quarter sometimes, treated their prisoners with humanity when they were bundled back. Hatred was not the motive which made our men endure all things. It was rather, as I have said, a refusal in their souls to be beaten in manhood by all the devils of war, by all its terrors, or by its beastliness, and at the back of all the thought that the old country was up against it, and that they were there to avert the evil. Young soldiers of ours, not only of officer rank, but of other ranks, as they were called, were inspired at the beginning, and some of them to the end, with a simple, boyish idealism. They saw no other causes of war than German brutality. The enemy to them was the monster who had to be destroyed lest the world and its beauty should perish, and that was true so long as the individual German, who loathed the war, obeyed the discipline of the herd leaders and did not revolt against the natural laws which, when the war had once started, bade him die in defense of his own fatherland. Many of those boys of ours made a dedication of their lives upon the altar of sacrifice, believing that by this service and this sacrifice they would help the victory of civilization over barbarism and of Christian morality over the devil's law. They believed that they were fighting to dethrone militarism, to ensure the happiness and liberties of civilized peoples, and were sure of the gratitude of their nation should they not have the fate to fall upon the field of honor, but go home blind or helpless. I have read many letters from boys now dead in which they express that faith. "Do not grieve for me," wrote one of them, "for I shall be proud to die for my country's sake." "I am happy," wrote another, I quote the tenor of his letters, "because though I hate war, I feel that this is the war to end war." We are the last victims of this way of argument. By smashing the German war machine, we shall prove for all time the criminal folly of militarism and junkerdom. There were young idealists like that, and they were to be envied for their faith, which they brought with them from public schools and from humble homes where they had read old books and heard old watchwords. I think, at the beginning of the war, there were many like that. But as it continued year after year, doubts crept in, dreadful suspicions of truth more complex than the old simplicity, a sense of revolt against sacrifice unequally shared and devoted to a purpose which was not that for which they had been called to fight. They had been told that they were fighting for liberty, but their first lesson was the utter loss of individual liberty under a discipline which made the private soldier no more than a number. They were ordered about like galley slaves, herded about like cattle, treated individually and in the mass with utter disregard of their comfort and well-being. Often, as I know, they were detrained at railheads in the wind and rain, and by ghastly errors of staff work kept waiting for their food until they were weak and famished. In the base camps, men of one battalion were drafted into other battalions, where they lost their old comrades and were unfamiliar with the speech and habits of a crowd belonging to different counties, the Sussex men going to a Manchester regiment, the Yorkshire men being drafted to a Surrey unit. By RTOs and AMLOs and camp commandments and town majors and staff pups, men were bullied and bundled about, not like human beings, but like dumb beasts. And in 1,000 ways injustice, petty tyranny, hard work, degrading punishments for trivial offenses struck at their souls and made the name of personal liberty a mockery. From their own individuality they argued to broader issues. Was this war for liberty? Were the masses of men on either side fighting with free will, as free men? Those Germans, were they not under discipline, each man of them, forced to fight whether they liked it or not, compelled to go forward to sacrifice, with machine guns behind them to shoot them down if they revolted against their slave drivers? What liberty had they to follow their conscience or their judgment, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die like all soldiers in all armies? Was it not rather that the masses of men engaged in slaughter were serving the purpose of powers above them, rival powers, greedy for one another's markets, covetous of one another's wealth, and callous of the lives of humble men? Surely if the leaders of the warring nations were put together for even a week in some such place as Hooge or the Hohenzollern redoubt, afflicted by the usual harassing fire, poison gas, mine explosions, lice, rats, and the stench of rotting corpses, with the certainty of death or dismemberment at the weekend, they would settle the business and come to terms before the week was out. I heard that proposition put forward many times by young officers of ours, and as an argument against their own sacrifice they found it unanswerable. Part 8, Chapter 5. The condition and psychology of their own country, as they read about it in the Paris Daily Mail, which was first to come into their billets, filled some of these young men with distress and disgust, strengthened into rage when they went home on leave. The deliberate falsification of news, the truth of which they heard from private channels, made them discredit the whole presentation of our case and state. They said propaganda with a sharp note of scorn. The breezy optimism of public men, preachers and journalists, never downcast by black news, never agonized by the slaughter in these fields, minimizing horrors and loss and misery, crowing over the enemy, prophesying early victory which did not come, accepting all the destruction of manhood while they stayed safe as a necessary and inevitable misfortune, had a depressing effect on men who knew they were doomed to die, in the law of averages, if the war went on. "Damn their optimism," said some of our officers. "It's too easy for those behind the lines. It is only we who have the right of optimism. It's we who have to do the dirty work. They seem to think we like the job. What are they doing to bring the end nearer?" The frightful suspicion entered the heads of some of our men, some of those I knew, that at home people liked the war and were not anxious to end it, and did not care a jot for the sufferings of the soldiers. Many of them came back from 7 days' leave fuming and sullen. Everybody was having a good time. Munition workers were earning wonderful wages and spending them on gramophones, pianos, furs, and the pictures. Everybody was gadding about in a state of joyous exultation. The painted flapper was making herself sick with the sweets of life after office hours in government employ, where she did little work for a lot of pocket money. The society girl was dancing bare-legged for war charities, pushing into bazaars for the poor, dear wounded, getting her pictures into the papers as a notable war worker, married for the 3rd time in 3 years. The middle-class cousin was driving staff officers to Whitehall, young gentlemen of the air service to Hendon, junior secretaries to their luncheon. Millions of girls were in some kind of fancy dress with buttons and shoulder straps, breeches and puttees, and they seemed to be making a game of the war and enjoying it thoroughly. Oxford duns were harvesting, and proud of their prowess with the pitchfork behold their patriotism, while the boys were being blown to bits on the Yser Canal. Miners were striking for more wages, factory hands were downing tools for fewer hours at higher pay, the government was paying any price for any labour, while Tommy Atkins drew his 1 and 2pence and made a little go a long way in a wayside estaminet, before jogging up the Menin Road to have his head blown off. The government had created a world of parasites and placemen housed in enormous hotels, where they were engaged at large salaries upon mysterious unproductive labours which seemed to have no result in frontline trenches. Government contractors were growing fat on the life of war, amassing vast fortunes, juggling with excess profits, battening upon the flesh and blood of boyhood in the fighting lines. These old men, these fat men, were breathing out fire and fury against the Hun, and vowing by all their gods that they would see their last son die in the last ditch, rather than agree to any peace, except that of destruction. There were FUG committees, it was Lord Kitchener's word, at the War Office, the Board of Trade, the Foreign Office, the Home Office, the Ministry of Munitions, the Ministry of Information, where officials on enormous salaries smoked cigars of costly brands, and decided how to spend vast sums of public money on organisation which made no difference to the man stifling his cough below the parapet in a wet fog of Flanders, staring across no man's land for the beginning of a German attack. In all classes of people there was an epidemic of dancing, jazzing, card-playing, theatre-going. They were keeping their spirits up wonderfully, too well for men slouching about the streets of London on leave, and wondering at all this gaiety, and thinking back to the things they had seen and forward to the things they would have to do. People at home, it seemed, were not much interested in the life of the trenches, anyhow they could not understand. The soldier listened to excited tales of air raids. A bomb had fallen in the next street. The windows had been broken. Many people had been killed in a house somewhere in Hackney. It was frightful. The Germans were devils. They ought to be torn to pieces, every one of them. The soldier on leave saw crowds of people taking shelter in underground railways, working men among them, sturdy lads, panic-stricken. But for his own wife and children he had an evil sense of satisfaction in these sights. It would do them good. They would know what war meant just a little. They would not be so easy in their damned optimism. An air raid? Lord God, did they know what a German barrage was like? Did they guess how men walked day after day through harassing fire to the trenches? Did they have any faint idea of life in a sector where men stood, slept, ate, worked, under the fire of 8-inch shells, 5.9s, trench mortars, rifle grenades, machine gun bullets, snipers, to say nothing of poison gas, long-range fire on the billets in small farmsteads, and on every moonlight night air raids above wooden hutments so closely crowded into a small space that hardly a bomb could fall without killing a group of men. "Oh, but you have your dugouts," said a careless little lady. The soldier smiled. It was no use talking. The people did not want to hear the tragic side of things. Bairnsfather's old bill seemed to them to typify the spirit of the fighting man, Alpha Mo, Kaiser. The British soldier was gay and careless of death always. Shell fire meant nothing to him. If he were killed well, After all, what else could he expect? Wasn't that what he was out for? The twice-married girl knew a charming boy in the Air Force. He had made love to her even before Charlie was done in. These dear boys were so greedy for love, she could not refuse them, poor darlings. Of course, they had all got to die for liberty, and that sort of thing. It was very sad. A terrible thing, war. Perhaps she had better give up dancing for a week, until Charlie had been put into the casualty lists. "What are we fighting for?" asked officers back from leave, turning over the pages of the Sketch and Tatler, with pictures of race meetings, strike meetings, bare-backed beauties at war bazaars, and portraits of profiteers in the latest honors list. Are we going to die for these swine? These parasites and prostitutes? Is this the war for noble ideals, liberty, Christianity, and civilization? To hell with all this filth. The world has gone mad, and we are the victims of insanity. Some of them said that below all that froth there were deep and quiet waters in England. They thought of the anguish of their own wives and mothers, their noble patience, their uncomplaining courage, their spiritual faith in the purpose of the war. Perhaps at the heart England was true and clean and pitiful. Perhaps, after all, many people at home were suffering more than the fighting men, in agony of spirit. It was unwise to let bitterness poison their brains. Anyhow, they had to go on. How long, O Lord? "How long is it going to last?" asked the London Rangers of their chaplain. He lied to them and said another 3 months. Always he had absolute knowledge that the war would end 3 months later. That was certain. Courage, he said. Courage to the end of the last lap. Most of the long service men were dead and gone long before the last lap came. It was only the new boys who went as far as victory. He asked permission of the general to withdraw 19 of them from the line to instruct them for communion. They were among the best soldiers and not afraid of the ridicule of their fellows because of their religious zeal. The chaplain's main purpose was to save their lives, for a while, and give them a good time and spiritual comfort. They had their good time. 3 weeks later came the German attack on Arras, and they were all killed. Every man of them. The chaplain, an Anglican, found it hard to reconcile Christianity with such a war as this, but he did not camouflage the teachings of the master he tried to serve. He preached to his men the gospel of love and forgiveness of enemies. It was reported to the general, who sent for him. "Look here, I can't let you go preaching soft stuff to my men. I can't allow all that nonsense about love. My job is to teach them to hate. You must either cooperate with me or go." The chaplain refused to change his faith or his teaching, and the general thought better of his intervention. For all chaplains it was difficult. Simple souls were bewildered by the conflict between the spirit of Christianity and the spirit of war. Many of them, officers as well as men, were blasphemous in their scorn of parson stuff, some of them frightfully ironical. A friend of mine watched 2 chaplains passing by. One of them was a tall man with a crown and star on his shoulder strap. "I wonder," said my friend, with false simplicity, "whether Jesus Christ would have been a lieutenant colonel?" On the other hand, many men found help in religion and sought its comfort with a spiritual craving. They did not argue about Christian ethics and modern warfare. Close to death, in the midst of tragedy, conscious in a strange way of their own spiritual being, and of a spirituality present among masses of men above the muck of war, the stench of corruption, and fear of bodily extinction, they groped out toward God. They searched for some divine wisdom greater than the folly of the world, for a divine aid which would help them to greater courage. The Spirit of God seemed to come to them across no man's land with pity and comradeship. Catholic soldiers had a simpler, stronger faith than men of Protestant denominations, whose faith depended more on ethical arguments and intellectual reasonings. Catholic chaplains had an easier task. Leaving aside all argument, they heard the confessions of the soldiers, gave them absolution for their sins, said Mass for them in wayside barns, administered the sacraments, held the cross to their lips when they fell mortally wounded, anointed them when the surgeon's knife was at work, called the names of Jesus and Mary into dying ears. There was no need of argument here. The old faith which has survived many wars, many plagues, and the old wickedness of men was still full of consolation to those who accepted it as little children, and by their own agony hoped for favor from the man of sorrows who was hanged upon a cross, and found a mother love in the vision of Mary, which came to them when they were in fear and pain and the struggle of death. The padre had a definite job to do in the trenches, and for that reason was allowed more liberty in the line than other chaplains. Battalion officers, surgeons, and nurses were patient with mysterious rites which they did not understand, but which gave comfort, as they saw, to wounded men and the heroism with which many of those priests worked under fire, careless of their own lives, exalted by spiritual fervor, yet for the most part human and humble, and large-hearted and tolerant, aroused a general admiration throughout the army. Many of the Protestant clergy were equally devoted, but they were handicapped by having to rely more upon providing physical comforts for the men than upon spiritual acts, such as anointing and absolution, which were accepted without question by Catholic soldiers. Yet the Catholic Church, certain of its faith, and all other churches claiming that they teach the gospel of Christ, have been challenged to explain their attitude during the war and the relation of their teaching to the world tragedy, the great crime which has happened. It will not be easy for them to do so. They will have to explain how it is that German bishops, priests, pastors and flocks, undoubtedly sincere in their professions of faith, deeply pious, as our soldiers saw in Cologne, and fervent in their devotion to the sacraments on their side of the fighting line, as the Irish Catholics on our side were able to reconcile this piety with their war of aggression. The faith of the Austrian Catholics must be explained in relation to their crimes, if they were criminal, as we say they were, in leading the way to this war by their ultimatum to Serbia. If Christianity has no restraining influence upon the brutal instincts of those who profess and follow its faith, then surely it is time the world abandoned so ineffective a creed and turned to other laws likely to have more influence on human relationships. That, brutally, is the argument of the thinking world against the clergy of all nations who all claimed to be acting according to the justice of God and the Spirit of Christ. It is a powerful argument, for the simple mind, rejecting casuistry, cuts straight to the appalling contrast between Christian profession and Christian practice, and says, here, in this war, there was no conflict between one faith and another, but a murderous death struggle between many nations holding the same faith, preaching the same gospel, and claiming the same God as their protector. Let us seek some better truth than that hypocrisy. Let us, if need be, in honesty, get back to the savage worship of national gods, the Jew of the tribe. My own belief is that the war was no proof against the Christian faith, but rather is a revelation that we are as desperately in need of the Spirit of Christ as at any time in the history of mankind. But I think the clergy of all nations, apart from a heroic and saintly few, subordinated their faith, which is a gospel of charity, to national limitations. They were patriots before they were priests, and their patriotism was sometimes as limited, as narrow, as fierce, and as bloodthirsty as that of the people who looked to them for truth and light. They were often fiercer, narrower, and more desirous of vengeance than the soldiers who fought, because it is now a known truth that the soldiers, German and Austrian, French and Italian and British, were sick of the unending slaughter long before the ending of the war, and would have made a peace more fair than that which now prevails if it had been put to the common vote in the trenches. Whereas the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop of Cologne, and the clergy who spoke from many pulpits in many nations, under the cross of Christ, still stoked up the fires of hate and urged the armies to go on fighting in the cause of justice, for the defense of the fatherland, for Christian righteousness, to the bitter end. Those words are painful to write, but as I am writing this book for truth's sake, at all cost, I let them stand. Part 8, Chapter 7. The men came home in a queer mood, startling to those who had not watched them out there, and to those who welcomed peace with flags. Even before their homecoming, which was delayed week after week, month after month, unless they were lucky young miners out for the victory push and back again quickly, strange things began to happen in France and Flanders, Egypt and Palestine. Men who had been long patient became suddenly impatient. Men who had obeyed all discipline broke into disobedience bordering on mutiny. They elected spokesmen to represent their grievances, like trade unionists. They answered back to their officers in such large bodies, with such threatening anger, that it was impossible to give them field punishment number 1 or any other number, especially as their battalion officers sympathized mainly with their point of view. They demanded demobilization according to their terms of service, which was for the duration of the war. They protested against the gross inequalities of selection by which men of short service were sent home, before those who had been out in 1914, 1915, 1916. They demanded justness, fair play, and denounced red tape and official lies. "We want to go home," was their shout on parade. A serious business, subversive of discipline. Similar explosions were happening in England. Bodies of men broke camp at Folkestone and other camps, demonstrated before town halls, demanded to speak with mayors, generals, any old fellows who were in authority, and refused to embark for France until they had definite pledges that they would receive demobilization papers without delay. Whitehall, the sacred portals of the War Office, the holy ground of the Horse Guards parade, were invaded by bodies of men who had commandeered ambulances and lorries and had made long journeys from their depots. They, too, demanded demobilization. They refused to be drafted out for service to India, Egypt, Archangel, or anywhere. They had done their bit, according to their contract. It was for the War Office to fulfill its pledges. Justice was the word on their lips, and it was a word which put the wind up, as soldiers say, any staff officers and officials who had not studied the laws of justice as they concern private soldiers, and who had dealt with them after the armistice and after the peace as they had dealt with them before as numbers, counters to be shifted here and there, according to the needs of the high command. What was this strange word justice on soldiers' lips? Red tape squirmed and writhed about the business of demobilization. Orders were made, communicated to the men, cancelled even at the railway gates. Promises were made and broken. Conscripts were drafted off to India, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Archangel, against their will and contrary to pledge. Men on far fronts, years absent from their wives and homes, were left to stay there, fever-stricken, yearning for home, despairing. And while the old war was not yet cold in its grave, we prepared for a new war against Bolshevik Russia, arranging for the spending of more millions, the sacrifice of more boys of ours, not openly, with the consent of the people, but on the sly, with a fine art of camouflage. The purpose of the new war seemed to many men who had fought for liberty and outrage against the self-determination of peoples which had been the fundamental promise of the League of Nations, and a blatant hypocrisy on the part of a nation which denied self-government to Ireland. The ostensible object of our intervention in Russia was to liberate the Russian masses from the bloody tyranny of the Bolsheviks, but this ardor for the liberty of Russia had not been manifest during the reign of Tsardom and Grand Dukes, when there were massacres of mobs in Moscow, bloody Sundays in St. Petersburg, pogroms in Riga, floggings of men and girls in many prisons, and when free speech, liberal ideas and democratic uprisings had been smashed by Cossack knout and by the torture of Siberian exile. Anyhow, many people believed that it was none of our business to suppress the Russian Revolution or to punish the leaders of it, and it was suspected by British working men that the real motive behind our action was not a noble enthusiasm for liberty, but an endeavor to establish a reactionary government in Russia in order to crush a philosophy of life more dangerous to the old order in Europe than high explosives, and to get back the gold that had been poured into Russia by England and France. By a strange paradox of history, French journalists, forgetting their own revolution, the cruelties of Robespierre and Marat, the September massacres, the torture of Marie Antoinette in the Tuileries, the guillotining of many fair women of France, and after 1870 the terrors of the Commune, were most horrified by the anarchy in Russia and most fierce in denunciation of the bloody struggle by which a people made mad by long oppression and infernal tyranny strove to gain the liberties of life. Thousands of British soldiers newly come from war in France were sullenly determined that they would not be dragged off to the new adventure. They were not alone. As Lord Rothermere pointed out, a French regiment mutinied on hearing a mere unfounded report that it was being sent to the Black Sea. The United States and Japan were withdrawing. Only a few of our men, disillusioned by the ways of peace, missing the old comradeship of the ranks, restless, purposeless, not happy at home, seeing no prospect of good employment, said, "Hell, why not the army again, an Archangel, or any old where?" and volunteered for Mr. Winston Churchill's little war. After the trouble of demobilization came peace pageants and celebrations and flag wavings, but all was not right with the spirit of the men who came back. Something was wrong. They put on civilian clothes again, looked to their mothers and wives, very much like the young men who had gone to business in the peaceful days before the August of 14. But they had not come back the same men. Something had altered in them. They were subject to queer moods, queer tempers, fits of profound depression alternating with a restless desire for pleasure. Many of them were easily moved to passion when they lost control of themselves. Many were bitter in their speech, violent in opinion, frightening. For some time, while they drew their unemployment pensions, they did not make any effort to get work for the future. They said, "That can wait. I've done my bit. The country can keep me for a while. I helped to save it. Let's go to the movies." They were listless when not excited by some show. Something seemed to have snapped in them, their willpower. A quiet day at home did not appeal to them. "Are you tired of me?" said the young wife wistfully. "Aren't you glad to be home?" "It's a dull sort of life," said some of them. The boys, unmarried, hung about street corners, searched for their pals, formed clubs where they smoked incessantly and talked in an aimless way. Then began the search for work. Boys without training looked for jobs with wages high enough to give them a margin for amusement, after the cost of living decently had been reckoned on the scale of high prices mounting higher and higher. Not so easy as they had expected. The girls were clinging to their jobs, would not let go of the pocket money which they had spent on frocks. Employers favoured girl labour, found it efficient and, on the whole, cheap. Young soldiers who had been very skilled with machine guns, trench mortars, hand grenades, found that they were classed with the ranks of unskilled labour in civil life. That was not good enough. They had fought for their country. They had served England. Now they wanted good jobs with short hours and good wages. They meant to get them. And meanwhile prices were rising in the shops. Suits of clothes, boots, food, anything were at double and treble the price of pre-war days. The profiteers were rampant. They were out to bleed the men who had been fighting. They were defrauding the public with sheer, undisguised robbery, and the government did nothing to check them. England, they thought, was rotten all through. Who cared for the men who had risked their lives and bore on their bodies the scars of war? The pensions doled out to blinded soldiers would not keep them alive. The consumptives, the gassed, the paralyzed, were forgotten in institutions where they lay hidden from the public eye. Before the war had been over 6 months, our heroes, our brave boys in the trenches, were without preference in the struggle for existence. Employers of labour gave them no special consideration. In many offices they were told bluntly, as I know, that they had wasted 3 or 4 years in the army and could not be of the same value as boys just out of school. The officer class was hardest hit in that way. They had gone straight from the public schools and universities to the army. They had been lieutenants, captains and majors in the Air Force, or infantry battalions, or tanks or trench mortars, and they had drawn good pay, which was their pocket money. Now they were at a loose end, hating the idea of office work, but ready to knuckle down to any kind of decent job with some prospect ahead. What kind of job? What knowledge had they of use in civil life? None. They scanned advertisements, answered likely invitations, were turned down by elderly men who said, "I've had 200 applications, and none of you young gentlemen from the army are fit to be my office boy." They were the same elderly men who had said, "We'll fight to the last ditch. If I had 6 sons, I would sacrifice them all in the cause of liberty and justice." Elderly officers who had lost their businesses for their country's sake, who with a noble devotion had given up everything to do their bit, paced the streets searching for work, and were shown out of every office where they applied for a post. I know one officer of good family and distinguished service who hawked round a subscription book to private houses. It took him more courage than he had needed under shell fire to ring the bell and ask to see the lady of the house. He thanked God every time the maid handed back his card and said, "Not at home." On the first week's work he was £4 out of pocket. Here and there an elderly officer blew out his brains. Another sucked a rubber tube fastened to the gas jet. It would have been better if they had fallen on the field of honour. Where was the nation's gratitude for the men who had fought and died or fought and lived? What is it for this reward in peace that nearly 1 million of our men gave up their lives? That question is not my question. It is the question that was asked by millions of men in England in the months that followed the armistice, and it was answered in their own brains by a bitterness and indignation out of which may be lit the fires of the revolutionary spirit. At street corners, in tramway cars, in tea shops where young men talked at the table next to mine, I listened to conversations not meant for my ears, which made me hear in imagination, and afar off, yet not very far, perhaps, the dreadful rumble of revolution, the violence of mobs led by fanatics. It was the talk mostly of demobilized soldiers. They asked one another, what did we fight for? And then other questions such as, wasn't this a war for liberty? Or, we fought for the land, didn't we? Then why shouldn't we share the land? Or why should we be bled white by profiteers? They mentioned the government, and then laughed in a scornful way. The government, said one man, is a conspiracy against the people. All its power is used to protect those who grow fat on big jobs, big trusts, big contracts. It used to smash the German Empire in order to strengthen and enlarge the British Empire for the sake of those who grab the oil wells, the gold fields, the minerals, and the markets of the world. Part 8, Chapter 8. Out of such talk revolution is born, and revolution will not be averted by pretending that such words are not being spoken and that such thoughts are not seething among our working classes. It will only be averted by cutting at the root of public suspicion, by cleansing our political state of its corruption and folly, and by a clear, strong call of noble-minded men to a new way of life, in which a great people believing in the honor and honesty of its leadership, and in fair reward for good labor, shall face a period of poverty with courage, and cooperate unselfishly for the good of the Commonwealth, inspired by a sense of fellowship with the workers of other nations. We have a long way to go and many storms to weather before we reach that state, if, by any grace that is in us and above us, we reach it. For there are disease and insanity in our present state, due to the travail of the war and the education of the war. The daily newspapers for many months have been filled with the record of dreadful crimes, of violence and passion. Most of them have been done by soldiers or ex-soldiers. The attack on the police station at Epsom, the destruction of the town hall at Luton, revealed a brutality of passion, a murderous instinct, which have been manifested again and again in other riots and street rows and solitary crimes. Those last are the worst because they are not inspired by a sense of injustice, however false, or any mob passion, but by homicidal mania and secret lust. The many murders of young women, the outrages upon little girls, the violent robberies that have happened since the demobilizing of the armies have appalled decent-minded people. They cannot understand the cause of this epidemic after a period when there was less crime than usual. The cause is easy to understand. It is caused by the discipline and training of modern warfare. Our armies, as all armies, established an intensive culture of brutality. They were schools of slaughter. It was the duty of officers, like Colonel Ronald Campbell, O.C., Bayonets, a delightful man, to inspire blood-lust in the brains of gentle boys who instinctively disliked butcher's work. By an ingenious system of psychology he played upon their nature, calling out the primitive barbarism which has been overlaid by civilized restraints, liberating the brute which has been long chained up by law and the social code of gentle life, but lurks always in the secret lairs of the human heart. It is difficult when the brute has been unchained, for the purpose of killing Germans, to get it into the collar again with a cry of, "Down, dog, down." Generals, as I have told, were against the soft stuff preached by parsons, who were not quite militarized, though army chaplains. They demanded the gospel of hate, not that of love. But hate, when it dominates the psychology of men, is not restricted to one objective, such as a body of men behind barbed wire. It is a spreading poison. It envenoms the whole mind, like jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on. Our men, living in holes in the earth like ape men, were taught the ancient code of the jungle law, to track down human beasts in no man's land, to jump upon their bodies in the trenches, to kill quickly, silently, in a raid, to drop a hand grenade down a dugout crowded with men, blowing their bodies to bits, to lie patiently for hours in a shell hole for a sniping shot at any head which showed, to bludgeon their enemy to death or spit him on a bit of steel, to get at his throat, if need be with nails and teeth. The code of the ape-man is bad for some temperaments. It is apt to become a habit of mind. It may surge up again when there are no Germans present, but some old woman behind an open till, or some policeman with a bull's-eye lantern and a truncheon, or in a street riot where fellow citizens are for the time being the enemy. Death, their own or other people's, does not mean very much to some who, in the trenches, sat within a few yards of stinking corpses, knowing that the next shell might make such of them. Life was cheap in war. Is it not cheap in peace? The discipline of military life is mainly an imposed discipline, mechanical and enforced in the last resort not by reason, but by field punishment or by a firing platoon. Whereas many men were made brisk and alert by discipline and saw the need of it for the general good, others were always in secret rebellion against its restraints of the individual will, and as soon as they were liberated broke away from it as slaves from their chains, and did not substitute self-discipline for that which had weighed heavy on them. With all its discipline, army life was full of lounging, hanging about, waste of time, waiting for things to happen. It was an irresponsible life for the rank and file. Food was brought to them, clothes were given to them, entertainments were provided behind the line, sports organized, their day ordered by high powers. There was no need to think for themselves, to act for themselves. They moved in herds dependent on their leaders. That, too, was a bad training for the individualism of civil life. It tended to destroy personal initiative and willpower. Another evil of the abnormal life of war sowed the seeds of insanity in the brains of men not strong enough to resist it. Sexually, they were starved. For months they lived out of the sight and presence of women. But they came back into villages or towns where they were tempted by any poor slut who winked at them and infected them with illness. Men went to hospital with venereal disease in appalling numbers. Boys were ruined and poisoned for life. Future generations will pay the price of war not only in poverty and by the loss of the unborn children of the boys who died, but by an enfeebled stock and the heritage of insanity. The Prime Minister said one day, "The world is suffering from shell shock." That was true, but it suffered also from the symptoms of all that illness which comes from syphilis, whose breeding ground is war. The majority of our men were clean-living and clean-hearted fellows who struggled to come unscathed in soul from most of the horrors of war. They resisted the education of brutality and were not envenomed by the gospel of hate. Out of the dark depths of their experience they looked up to the light and had visions of some better law of life than that which led to the world tragedy. It would be a foul libel on many of them to besmirch their honor by a general accusation of lowered morality and brutal tendencies. Something in the spirit of our race and in the quality of our home life kept great numbers of them sound, chivalrous, generous-hearted, in spite of the frightful influences of degradation bearing down upon them out of the conditions of modern warfare. But the weak men, the vicious, the murderous, the primitive, were overwhelmed by these influences, and all that was base in them was intensified, and their passions were unleashed, with what result we have seen, and shall see, to our sorrow and the nation's peril. The nation was in great peril after this war, and that peril will not pass in our lifetime except by heroic remedies. We won victory in the field, and at the cost of our own ruin. We smashed Germany and Austria and Turkey, but the structure of our own wealth and industry was shattered, and the very foundations of our power were shaken and sapped. 9 months after the armistice, Great Britain was spending at the rate of £2 million a day in excess of her revenue. She was burdened with a national debt which had risen from 645 millions in 1914 to 7,800 millions in 1919. The pre-war expenditure of £200 million per annum on the Navy, Army, and civil service pensions and interest on national debt had risen to 750 millions. Our exports were dwindling down, owing to decreased output, so that foreign exchanges were rising against us, and the American dollar was increasing in value as our proud old sovereign was losing its ancient standard. So that, for all imports from the United States, we were paying higher prices, which rose every time the rate of exchange dropped against us. The slaughter of 900,000 men of ours, the disablement of many more than that, had depleted our ranks of labor, and there was a paralysis of all our industry, owing to the dislocation of its machinery for purposes of war, the soaring cost of raw material, the crippling effect of high taxation, the rise in wages to meet high prices, and the lethargy of the workers. Ruin, immense, engulfing, annihilating to our strength as a nation and as an empire, stares us brutally in the eyes at the time I write this book, and I find no consolation in the thought that other nations in Europe, including the German people, are in the same desperate plight, or worse. Part 8, Chapter 9. The nation, so far, has not found a remedy for the evil that has overtaken us. Rather, in a kind of madness that is not without a strange splendor, like a ship that goes down with drums beating and banners flying, we are racing toward the rocks. At this time, when we are sorely stricken and in dire poverty and debt, we have extended the responsibilities of empire and of world power as though we had illimitable wealth. Our sphere of influence includes Persia, Tibet, Arabia, Palestine, Egypt, a vast part of the Mohammedan world. Yet if any part of our possessions were to break into revolt or raise a holy war against us, we should be hard-pressed for men to uphold our power and prestige, and our treasury would be called upon in vain for gold. After the war which was to crush militarism, the Air Force alone proposed an annual expenditure of more than twice as much money as the whole cost of the army before the war. While the armaments of the German people, whom we defeated in the war against militarism, are restricted to a few warships and a navy of 100,000 men, at a cost reckoned as £10 million a year, we are threatened with a naval and military program costing £300 million a year. Was it for this our men fought? Was it to establish a new imperialism, upheld by the power of guns, that 900,000 boys of ours died in the War of Liberation. I know it was otherwise. There are people at the street corners who know, and in the tram cars and factories and little houses in mean streets where there are empty chairs and the portraits of dead boys. It will go hard with the government of England if it plays a grandiose drama before hostile spectators who refuse to take part in it. It will go hard with the nation, for it will be engulfed in anarchy. At the present time, in this August of 1919, when I write these words, 5 years after another August, this England of ours, this England which I love, because its history is in my soul and its blood is in my body, and I have seen the glory of its spirit, is sick, nigh unto death. Only great physicians may heal it, and its old vitality struggling against disease, and its old sanity against insanity. Our empire is greater now in spaciousness than ever before, but our strength to hold it has ebbed low, because of much death, and a strain too long endured, and strangling debt. The workman is tired, and has slackened in his work. In his scheme of life he desires more luxury than our poverty affords. He wants higher wages, shorter hours, and less output. Reasonable desires in our state before the war, unreasonable now because the cost of the war has put them beyond human possibility. He wants low prices with high wages and less work. It is false arithmetic, and its falsity will be proved by a tremendous crash. Some crash must come, tragic and shocking to our social structure. I see no escape from that, and only the hope that in that crisis the very shock of it will restore the mental balance of the nation, and that all classes will combine under leaders of unselfish purpose and fine vision, eager for evolution and not revolution, for peace and not for blood, for Christian charity and not for hatred, for civilization and not for anarchy, to reshape the conditions of our social life and give us a new working order, with more equality of labor and reward, duty and sacrifice, liberty and discipline of the soul, combining the virtue of patriotism with a generous spirit to other peoples across the old frontiers of hate. That is the hope, but not the certainty. It is only by that hope that one may look back upon the war with anything but despair. All the lives of those boys whom I saw go marching up the roads of France and Flanders to the fields of death, so splendid, so lovely in their youth, will have been laid down in vain if by their sacrifice the world is not uplifted to some plane a little higher than the barbarity which was let loose in Europe. They will have been betrayed if the agony they suffered is forgotten, and the war to end war leads to preparations for new, more monstrous conflict. Or is war the law of human life? Is there something more powerful than cases and castes which drives masses of men against other masses in death struggles which they do not understand? Are we really poor beasts in the jungle, striving by tooth and claw, high velocity and poison gas, for the survival of the fittest in an endless conflict? If that is so, then God mocks at us. Or rather, if that is so, there is no God such as we men may love with love for men. The world will not accept that message of despair, and millions of men today who went through the agony of the war are inspired by the humble belief that humanity may be cured of its cruelty and stupidity, and that a brotherhood of peoples more powerful than a league of nations may be founded in the world after its present sickness and out of the conflict of its anarchy. That is the new vision which leads men on, and if we can make one step that way, it will be better than that backward fall which civilization took when Germany played the devil and led us all into the jungle. The devil in Germany had to be killed. There was no other way, except by helping the Germans to kill it before it mastered them. Now let us exercise our own devils and get back to kindness toward all men of good will. That also is the only way to heal the heart of the world and our own state. Let us seek the beauty of life and God's truth somehow, remembering the boys who died too soon, and all the falsity and hatred of these past 5 years. By blood and passion there will be no healing. We have seen too much blood. We want to wipe it out of our eyes and souls. Let us have peace.
The end. Best audiobooks for free hopes that you have enjoyed this production of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble, as your subscription is the support we need to create more great free content.